Thank you. So we're going to get ahead early. I think this promises to be a fascinating discussion. I was lucky enough to hear Michael earlier this week already, so I've had something of a preview at the Policy Exchange. So I should introduce the panel to start with. To my left, we have Adrian Pabst, Professor of Politics at University of Kent. We have Claire Ainsley here, Director of the Project on Centre-Left Renewal at the Progressive Policy Institute. John Cruddas here, former MP for Dagenham, who's been talking about these issues for a long time now. And obviously we have Michael at the end here, author of, well, how many books now? Getting 15, 16. Wow, that's something for me to aim for. I'm struggling to get through my first at the moment. So I think we can kick off straight away, and we can welcome Michael to the stage.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be here, and I confess it's also a bit intimidating, given the fact that many people in the audience and on the panel are people whose thinking has influenced my own over the years. I'm reminded of a story told about the aftermath of the great Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood of 1889. One of the individuals who drowned in this flood went to heaven. And as he was being processed through the pearly gates, St. Peter asked, there's a lot of interest in this catastrophe. Would you mind giving a talk about it, here in heaven? And so he agreed, and the time came, and the heavenly host assembled to learn about this great flood in Pennsylvania. And just when the speaker was about to begin, St. Peter leaned over and whispered in his ear, "I don't want to make you self-conscious, but Noah is in the audience." So I beg the indulgence of the many Noahs in the audience today. Liberalism is under attack, we are told, by political, academic, and media establishments on both sides of the Atlantic. At the global level, we are told, the rule-based liberal world order, founded by the U.S. and its allies after World War II, is giving way to great power competition. Liberal democracy itself, we are told, is under assault from within as well as from without by authoritarians, including so-called authoritarian populists in Western democracies who come to power by winning free and fair elections. And the liberal idea of free speech and free debate, we are told, is crumbling thanks to the thought policing of the woke left and the misinformation of the populist right. In response to this, critics of liberalism, including many of those today known as post-liberals, along with like-minded communitarians, social conservatives, and the occasional left conservative, might be inclined to say, good riddance. The demise of liberalism couldn't happen to a more deserving ism. On one issue, however, most defenders and critics of liberalism often agree: the potential longevity of liberalism as a social and economic order. Liberals hope that liberalism can last forever. Many post-liberals fear that it will. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote, "Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned." If the nightmare of anti-communists during the Cold War was an endless future of totalitarian terror, the nightmare of today's critics of liberalism is an endless future of constant social upheaval and atomization as a result of unchecked markets and radical individualism. Not a boot stamping on a human face forever, but a high-tech appliance in need of the latest upgrades forever. What many critics as well as defenders of liberalism tend to overlook is the possibility that liberalism in the economy in politics and in culture will prove to be unstable and self-liquidating. To put it another way, a liberal social order may be an ephemeral transition between one non-liberal system and another. The ideal of most contemporary liberals, I think it is fair to say, is a vision of society as three self-correcting markets: an economic market, a political market, and a cultural market. I use the term market for all three spheres because today's liberals in practice are guided more by the vision of self-correcting markets in academic economics than by the philosophies of Locke or Rawls or others. In each of these three markets, we are supposed to believe, the normal condition is healthy competition among a plurality of rivals. In a market economy, competition prevents the formation of economic monopolies. Any firm that temporarily attains a dominant market share inevitably will be whittled down to size by existing or new competitors. In the democratic political marketplace, parties will win only fleeting majorities and will soon be turned out by their adversaries. In the realm of culture and ideas, free debate and contestation will ensure that no stifling orthodoxy can be imposed. Liberalism then posits that society can be kept fluid and dynamic by never ceasing competition for consumers, voters, and audiences for ideas and art. As long as there is free and fair competition in commerce, monopolies with market power will not appear or will quickly be vanquished. As long as there is free and fair competition in politics, one-party rule is not a danger. And as long as there is free and fair competition in academic life and the media industry, we need not fear that a single faction with a single point of view will capture academics and journalism. The basic assumption of liberalism, then, is that competition more or less naturally and automatically eliminates concentrations of power: market power, political power, and cultural power. But this belief that competition is incompatible with concentration is an article of faith of the liberal creed that is refuted by actual experience. Let's begin with the economic market. In the real world, completely competitive markets cannot exist because perfect competition would soon drive down profits until they are the same as costs. In a perfectly competitive market, no firm would ever be able to exercise its market power to make a profit, and capitalism could not exist. Moreover, in certain kinds of industries, those characterized by increasing returns to scale, like manufacturing, and by network effects, like infrastructure grids and social media, competition, far from restraining monopoly, tends to produce monopoly as the end result. Each round of competition produces fewer and bigger rivals, until finally, in the absence of intervention by state antitrust or competition authorities, the most successful firm has established a monopoly or near monopoly in its field, and it need not cheat in order to do so. It may simply be slightly more efficient or slightly more user-friendly than its rival, and this slight advantage is rapidly compounded by a kind of snowball effect. Around 1900 in the United States, there were dozens of automobile startup companies. By the 1920s, these had been winnowed down to about a dozen, and by the 1950s, Detroit was dominated by the big three. The same process of elimination, following the later digital technology revolution, eliminated search engine rivals like Dogpile and Inktomi to give Google a near monopoly in the search engine industry. Microsoft has a dominant position similarly in software, thanks to the advantages of scale following deregulation of financial markets in the US. Many small protected local and state banks have disappeared, and winner-take-all dynamics has produced massive concentration in the American financial industry. The story is the same in the market of electoral politics. So-called dominant party systems, in which a single party or coalition of parties maintains a majority for long periods without authoritarian measures, have been common in democratic countries. Parties like America's New Deal Democrats, the Swedish Social Democrats, the Italian Christian Democrats, and the Japanese Liberal Democratic Party, which was neither liberal nor democratic, but it was a party, enjoyed periods of dominance and near fusion with the government for decades at a time. In the United States today, every big city and college town is run by the Democratic Party, every single one. So much for the hope of the American founder James Madison in Federalist Number 10, that a multiplicity of interests would prevent prolonged domination by any single faction or coalition of factions. We find the same pattern of monopoly and monoculture in the universities and establishment media. Instead of hosting vigorous debate among thinkers representing all shades of mainstream political and religious opinion, American universities, which I know best, are monocultures, in which upwards of 90% of professors are on the left wing of the Democratic Party. In the mass media, political and philosophical debate is often shut down by cancellation, the censorship and blacklisting of anyone whose views vary from those of center-left media staffers and nonprofit activists. None of this should surprise us if we recognize that competition produces winners. Winners whose monopoly of commerce, power, or influence then fortifies them against challengers. Marxists were wrong about many things, but they were right that in many industries, competitive capitalism tends to give way to monopoly capitalism. The same is true, as we have seen, of competitive politics in cultural and intellectual competition. In one area after another, not only do winners take all, winners also can keep all. Not forever, but for a very long time indeed. One response to the tendency of competition in liberal societies to be replaced by commercial monopoly, political monopoly, and cultural monopoly is what might be called liberal fundamentalism. The antitrust school, appropriately called competition policy in Europe, seeks to make the practice of liberal society conform to the theory. Liberals claim that the solution to the tendency of liberalism to engender concentrations of economic, political, and cultural power is more liberalism. In the economic realm, liberal fundamentalists often support vigorous antitrust or competition policy in order to break up large firms with dominant market shares. Rather like Isaac Newton's God, intervening now and then to correct unbalanced planetary orbits, the state competition authority will remove an impediment and allow the clockwork mechanism of liberal competition to begin again. But if dominant market share is the natural end result of competition in a certain industry, then breaking up the big successful firm and restarting the game with more players will only lead to the elimination of most of the competitors again and a new monopolist. A one-time intervention is not enough. Government competition authorities must constantly thwart mergers and must constantly pulverize any successful firm that grows beyond a certain predetermined limit. It goes without saying that the massive bureaucratic and judicial apparatus necessary for such a rigorous program of antitrust is incompatible with the liberal market system that the liberal fundamentalists are trying to preserve. At least in the economic realm, liberal fundamentalists are willing to contemplate government intervention. When it comes to the capture of universities by woke faculties and administrators, many of the same self-described defenders of the liberal tradition oppose both campus political monocultures and external interventions by university regents or by governments in the interest of what might be called intellectual antitrust. Opposed to both illiberal wokeness and anti-woke intervention in academic affairs by outsiders, liberal fundamentalists tend to end their often powerful critiques of left-wing capture of the academy with feeble calls for the dominant progressive professoriate to be nicer to conservatives and libertarians, whom the progressives consider to be the equivalents of Nazis and members of the Ku Klux Klan. In politics, today's liberals or classical liberals uniformly oppose populist politicians like Donald Trump and Nigel Farage and their European equivalents. But here again, the liberal fundamentalists are disarmed by their own principles. Although some no doubt would like to do so, they cannot simply outlaw populist parties and arrest and imprison populist politicians. Some principled liberals were doubtless sincerely disturbed by the attempts of partisan Democrats to prevent Donald Trump from running for re-election in 2024, this year, by jailing him on bogus charges or keeping his name off of Republican primary ballots. But their liberal faith leads liberal fundamentalists to believe that if the public were truly informed, then majorities would oppose populists and support the kind of neoliberal, third-way, centrist politician whom liberals like. As a result, their proposed antidotes to populism in politics, like their alternative to woke orthodoxy in universities, tends to just be more and better debate. The error of liberals, then, is to posit never-ending contests in politics, markets, and the culture. But contests come to an end, and they do so by rewarding winners and penalizing losers. Meritocracy engenders aristocracy, in which winners then rig the system to benefit their offspring. Free markets engender monopolies and oligopolies, which are then insulated by their scale and market power from competitors. The contest of ideas in universities and the media produces winners who then can shut down the contest and ban any ideas other than their own. Both champions and many critics of liberalism then treat liberalism as a possibly permanent social order instead of merely a transition between different kinds of long-lasting non-liberal regimes. What kind of non-liberal regime might succeed liberalism in the West? The conditions for a return of militarized, mobilized fascist or communist statism do not exist, for all the talk about the Weimar Republic and the return of Hitler and Mussolini and so on. More likely is a condition of unaccountable oligarchy and universal corruption. My old professor at Yale, Juan Lentz, I'm sure would come up with a good social scientific term like patrimonialism or clientelism, but I like to think of this as mafiocracy, government by mafias. Despite their differences, communism and liberalism both tend to weaken intermediate institutions and to atomize and isolate individuals. The weakening of communist state power in Eastern Europe and Russia, far from producing a renaissance of social and civic institutions, has often produced a kind of mafiocracy. The replacement of market competition by market power might produce a similar result in the West if liberalism mutates into something non-liberal. The regime would be a post-liberal order, so to speak, but not the kind of which today's post-liberal thinkers are likely to approve. Among others, I've used the term Brazilianization to describe a future in the industrial nations of the West, characterized by oligarchy, inequality, widespread corruption, and poor economic performance. As it happens, Brazil was the title of a dystopian science fiction movie directed by Terry Gilliam in 1985. In a conversation with the philosopher John Gray, I suggested that the satire suffered from a confusion of purposes because the dystopian regime was both tyrannical and incompetent. "Oh no," John replied, "tyranny and incompetence are usually combined." If I am right, then the aftermath of liberalism in the West is more likely to resemble Latin American dysfunction than the Central European totalitarianism of a century ago. A Mexican law professor, himself a victim of official harassment, once smiled and told me, "In Mexico, we view constitutions not as laws, but as aspirations." A widely shared proverb in Spanish America since colonial time has been "obedezco pero non cumplo." I obey, but I do not comply. In many dysfunctional societies, basic goods can be achieved only through informal means, like bribes or purchases on the black market. Even the rich and powerful are forced to pay off the books to get things done. One of the characteristics social types in such regimes is the fixer. The classic example in the United States is knowing somebody who knows somebody at City Hall who can get your traffic ticket fixed. In societies in which intermediate organizations and civic ethics have decayed, you need to know somebody who knows somebody to get anything done for a price. We are seeing the rise of the fixer economy in the allegedly liberal West. Increasingly, market goods and public services that used to be offered to all customers or citizens on a universal basis now require additional charges. In the United States, for an extra fee, you can drive in the reserved express lane on the highway, go through airport security faster, and see your doctor next week instead of next month or next year. Under Barack Obama, the Affordable Care Act, designed to provide insurance to the uninsured on the basis of the liberal principles of consumer choice and market competition, was gamed by insurance companies in such baffling ways that the federal government itself had to pay professional fixers called Sherpas, after the guides who help climbers ascend Mount Everest, to help perplexed citizen consumers fill out the incomprehensible insurance forms. Now, corruption is not always a bad thing. Corruption can soften and humanize despotic regimes and arrogant oligarchies. For Soviet citizens, Brezhnevian corruption was preferable to Stalinist rigor. But what I'm calling mafiocracy, characterized by person-to-person transactions, doing an end run around a facade of impersonal and market and state institutions, is seldom compatible with technological progress or civic flourishing. If today's Western liberalism decays into tomorrow's mafiocracy, then the specter of a perpetual appliance upgrade will be replaced by the specter of somebody fixing your ticket forever. If I'm right, then it is not enough for post-liberals and like-minded thinkers and reformers to oppose the radically individualistic and competitive version of liberalism. They must anticipate the possible kinds of non-liberal regimes into which liberal regimes over time may decay, regimes characterized by corrupt oligarchies at the top and an atomized and passive and powerless population below. What if the solution to the problems of liberalism is not more liberalism, but less liberalism? What if the only way to prevent the nearly inevitable tendency of liberalism to undermine itself by producing unchecked monopoly and oligopoly and oligarchy is to abandon liberalism altogether and restructure the economy, the political system, and the cultural system along explicitly non-liberal lines, by which I mean what in America we call non-libertarian. There are other systems can be compatible with the rule of law and competitive elections and so on. Since the 19th century, that has been the conclusion of three schools of thought: socialists, distributists, and pluralists. What is sometimes called socialism today in Western countries by politicians like Bernie Sanders in America is nothing more than liberal capitalism tempered by social insurance in a welfare state. Genuine socialism, defined as the nationalization of all large-scale enterprise and property, can, or at least should be, dismissed as an option. We have seen that authoritarian socialism in Marxist-Leninist forms merely replaces old nobilities with new hereditary ruling families and princelings, while sterilizing intellectual life and causing economic stagnation. If the danger we face is a fusion of political, economic, and cultural elites into homogeneous, unaccountable oligarchies, then deliberately bringing about a merger of elites in the name of socialism and hoping for better results would be insane. What about distributism? The term distributism is associated with the Catholic thinkers Hilaire Belloc and J.K. Chesterton. I'm using distributism here in a general sense to refer to all schools of thought which envision a society of small, self-reliant producers as an alternative to socialist statism, and centralized corporate capitalism. In this broad sense, the agrarian republicanism of Thomas Jefferson and William Jennings Bryan and the Southern agrarians in the United States can be described as distributist, along with various peasant parties and small producer movements in Europe and around the world, including the Indian version associated with Gandhi. The distributist ideal is very attractive, is very powerful in modern industrial democracies. In the United States, the institution that receives the highest favorability in public opinion polls is small business, followed by the military. Big business is as unpopular as big government. It may seem to be a paradox that many members of the working class think well of small business owners, who as a group tend to be the most opposed to higher wages and unionization for workers. But this ceases to be puzzling when we understand that many wage earners dream of quitting their jobs and leaving the proletariat and setting themselves up as small business owners or as self-employed artisans. As a descendant of small farmers and ranchers and small grocers in rural America, I understand the appeal of the distributist vision. But small producer distributism is anachronistic in a mechanized industrial civilization. In industrial societies like the US and UK and Germany, no more than 10 or 15% of citizens are self-employed. In the US, a slight majority of private sector workers are employed by firms with more than 500 employees. The only countries in the 21st century in which small farmers and small peddlers and small artisans and are a majority are the poorest and least developed nations like Ethiopia. Intelligent distributists have always recognized that the defense of small producers in the economy requires government favoritism towards small proprietors and constant government intervention to thwart what would otherwise be the natural tendency of technology-based capitalism to produce disintermediation and corporate concentration. A century ago, small retailers in the United States sought to outlaw chain stores in campaigns echoed in today's campaigns against big box stores like Walmart. Among other things, they sought to preserve their local monopolies by thwarting the distribution of the Sears catalog and getting state legislatures to outlaw discounts for big firms and big companies. But efforts to freeze a particular business structure in place indefinitely are doomed by technological and commercial innovation. Having displaced many small retailers, Walmart may find its business model obsolete if robot vehicles can deliver packages directly to consumers at their homes from automated factories. Distributism, then, is as unlikely to be realized as an alternative to modern liberalism in the 21st century as it was in the 19th and 20th centuries. The other major alternative to liberalism as a way of structuring a modern society is pluralism. Unlike distributism, pluralism does not seek to freeze any particular historical or agricultural industrial structure in place. The essence of pluralism is a high degree of autonomy and self-government by industries and occupations. But the particular mix of self-governing industries and occupations can change over time. By pluralism, I mean not the fact of interest group or ethnic pluralism in a diverse society, but what Paul Hirst called the pluralist theory of the state. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Catholic social thinkers, secular French Republican solidarists, English guild socialists, and others were attracted to pluralism as an alternative to liberalism and socialism. Whatever their other differences, pluralists agreed that voting by individuals every few years is not enough to make representation meaningful. Between elections, occupational groups, and in some cases ethno-religious groups, should play formal roles in policy making that affects them, in addition to be granted a high degree of autonomy within their realm by the state. Pluralists reject the idea of an omnicompetent territorial state representing a unitary sovereign. in favor of a quasi-medieval conception of the polity as a community of communities. The territorial state rules directly in the limited civic sphere, but it reigns indirectly in other realms. Corporatism is the form that pluralism has typically taken in the industrial economy. The term corporatism is often misused to mean the corruption of politics by business interests. In pluralist theory, the term corporation means not an individual firm, but an entire occupation or industrial sector, organized as a self-governing association under the supervision of the state. Professional associations like the American Bar Association and the American Medical Association are corporations in this sectoral sense. And so were the medieval guilds that pluralists like Émile Durkheim in France and guild socialists in England sought to recreate in a form suitable for modern industrial society. Tripartism, defined as government-brokered collective bargaining among employers and labor unions, or representatives of both on trade boards or wage boards, is a version of economic corporatism. In the 20th century, fascist Italy and some other authoritarian regimes claimed that functional representation should replace political democracy. But the so-called state corporatism was rejected by what political scientists have called social corporatism, in which functional representation is a supplement, not a substitute, for free elections in a multi-party democracy. In 1940, the journalist John Chamberlain described the informal system of corporatism established in the United States by Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. The labor union, the consumers or producers cooperative, the institute, the syndicate, these are the important things in a democracy. If their power is evenly spread, if there are economic checks and balances to parallel the political checks and balances, then society will be democratic. For democracy is what results when you have a state of tension in society that permits no one group to dare bid for total power. Following World War II, most Western democracies embodied versions of democratic corporatism, even if they did not use the name. Collective bargaining was institutionalized in the core areas of the economy. In addition to labor unions, organized religious groups, including formerly persecuted or marginalized Catholics and Jews in Protestant countries, gained acceptance as part of an informal pluralistic religious establishment as an alternative to Protestant hegemony in the Anglophone nations in Germany. It is no coincidence that the greatest expansion of mass middle classes took place during this period of widespread collective bargaining in the West. Nor is it a coincidence that religious conflict in Western society was moderated by what the sociologist Will Herberg called the triple establishment: Protestant, Catholic, Jew. 20th century totalitarians viewed trade unions and churches as their natural enemies. So in practice have neoliberal regimes. Beginning in the late 20th century, neoliberal governments used globalization and mass immigration and anti-labor reforms to undermine organized labor. At the same time, anti-clerical intellectuals based in the universities and the media, like the new atheists of the last generation, launched a contemporary Kulturkampf against organized religion. The result of the dismantling of the institutionalized economic and religious pluralism of the mid-20th century has been the return of pre-1945 levels of class war and religious conflict. In the last half century, neoliberal regimes in the West have not only weakened or destroyed the culturally pluralist and economically corporatist arrangements of the post-World War II era, they have also promulgated a kind of placebo pluralism in the form of identity politics. Abstract pseudo-communities based on race, gender, and sexual orientation as defined by the neoliberal bureaucratic state are promoted as substitutes for authentic occupational and religious identities. The use of identity politics as a diversion from class politics and religious politics, and a divide and rule tactic by Western oligarchs, is as obvious as it is crude. In the United States, many corporations, including many allegedly progressive Silicon Valley and Wall Street corporations, divide their workers into so-called affinity groups on the basis of race and gender, even as they pay union-busting law firms to thwart efforts by their employees of all races and all sexes to unionize. Now, 21st century versions of democratic pluralism and corporatism would not resemble those of the mid-20th century in detail. Any new approach to consultation with religious groups by government, media, and academic industries in today's West as well must take into account the decline in traditional religious affiliation and the rise of unaffiliated nuns, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N-S, and unconventional creeds. Models of organized labor suitable to mass production factory workers a century ago are less suitable for many workers in the dominant service sector than other systems of collective bargaining, like wage boards or sectoral bargaining, which, as in France, covers all workers in a sector, even though most do not themselves belong to a union. Post-liberal pluralism and what I'm calling post-liberal mafiocracy both involve replacing rule-governed bureaucratic statism and allegedly impartial markets with bargaining and negotiation. But the bargaining in pluralism is institutionalized and formalized and regular and transparent and public, while the bargaining in mafiocracy is informal and personal and random. Despite these differences, it might be suggested that both formal pluralism and informal mafiocracy are more compatible with the nature of human beings as social animals who evolved in small groups and negotiate with their fellows than immense impersonal abstract systems based on states or markets. It goes without saying that a modern version of democratic pluralism would be rejected and opposed by contemporary liberals who are libertarian in economics and libertine in values. For classical liberals, trade unions are criminal labor cartels that are incompatible with a free market in labor. And from a liberal perspective, for governments to consult with and defer in particular areas to the sensibilities of diverse ethno-national or religious communities is a violation of the strict separation of church and state. Liberalism is inclined to treat institutionalized pluralist arrangements in the economy and the culture as embodiments of corruption. And so the battle lines must be drawn. Two of the possible alternatives to liberalism in the West, democratic socialism and distributism, in my view, are doomed to remain irrelevant. An updated version of pluralism, including tripartite labor business government arrangements of some kind, is the only kind of non-liberal governance that can provide a plausible alternative to both liberalism and the sort of regime characterized by oligarchy and generalized corruption into which liberalism over time is liable to decay. The odds of success for a rebuilding pluralism in the West are low, but the price of failure is very high indeed. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was completely fascinating. So what we're going to do now is we've got about an hour, I think, or a little bit less now, to listen to the guests on the panel here, and then we'll open it up to questions. So we'll try and split that roughly evenly. Adrian, do you want to kick off with or Claire, do you want to come in first with a few remarks?
You can do it from the lectern, or if you're recording better. Lectern, yes, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael, for that excellent lecture, to Adrian for inviting us to be part of this conference today. Michael has set out a number of the competing strains that liberalism is under, and I first wanted just to add some more into it to say that it's probably even worse than we think. So Michael has talked about monopoly capitalism, to sort of encapsulate it as being kind of one of the primary problems of where we are now. Authoritarianism on the right and on the left in the economic, governmental and cultural domains. But I would add to it what the kind of experience of the modern liberal order is, particularly from the perspective of working class people for whom our modern order just feels profoundly unstable, and particularly in the context of the slower growing economies. Monopoly capitalism, it's not irrelevant, but I think there's something even deeper about the experience, about how it actually feels. This promise that it's our hard work and our talent is what will get us on in life. It's what I keep telling my kids. I'm sure everybody else does, and the teachers are fighting the same battle. Saying that it's our hard work and talent that will be how we were rewarded in life, just feels for many people like that isn't the case anymore. Certainly their perception is that kind of basic settlement of society, that is what propels you forward, that's what creates your opportunities, that's how you get on and do well, that doesn't really exist anymore, that somehow that deal has broken down. The research I've been doing recently has looked at kind of people, working class voters in the States and over here, and so many people feel just that they are working hard, they're kind of doing the right thing, playing by the rules, paying their taxes, and they feel that they're not getting on for that. They don't feel that at the end of the month there's the kind of money that they would need to be able to sometimes afford what they would consider the essentials to be, let alone do the sorts of things that they think they should be, I think, rightly entitled to. Save up a bit, maybe afford that holiday that they wanted, maybe take their family for a treat. Often people will say that they themselves have done okay. I've been okay, but they will talk about their class as a whole doing worse now than they did previously. And they certainly fear for the next generation and think that the next generation will be worse off than themselves. And some of it might be perception, but that is really harmful, and some of it is grounded in reality. And voters that we spoke to over the summer in the States, particularly, I was looking at the kind of the swing states in the US, were talking about the idea of there being less of they call it like a legit middle class anymore. And to us in the UK, it's probably more what we would consider working class to be, but people would talk about there being a middle class America that didn't really quite exist anymore. And I think that this sense of this deal breaking down extends to many of our young people too. I think lots of young people themselves can see that the liberal order isn't delivering on the promise that they have been told will help achieve independence and opportunity. I think partly that's to do with the cost of housing in many of our societies, the cost of setting up your own home and moving out, and the things that you need to buy and afford to be able to get the deposit behind you, and so on. The lack of good prospects for young people who don't go to university, and then of course for many that do, they're not feeling like they get a good deal for their tuition fees and the amount that they're charged in terms of their living costs. So I think that economic settlement is at fault, and I think it's at the core. But as Michael outlined, of course, the cultural settlement too. The fact that opportunity has been so concentrated in parts of the country, and in particular families and classes, and that lack of opportunity is so widespread today, that people's hometowns feel like they've been left to decline. And then when development has happened, people haven't felt that it's necessarily the people locally that have been the ones primarily to benefit from that. And people finding that their views just aren't represented in any of the national debate, and that somehow their views might seem unwelcome or unfashionable or things that they can't say, particularly by those on the left of centre, and I would consider myself to be on the left of centre. And before I worked doing my current role, I worked with the Labour Party, and we went through a whole kind of systematic programme. And one thing that we did, which has kind of caught a bit of attention, is that we went from talking about our voters as, targets or something not human, to talking about them as our hero voters, which, you can quibble with the language. But the point of, this was Deborah Mattinson, my colleague who used to be Director of Strategy, who coined this term hero voters. The point was to say to our own activists and our own party, you need to respect people. This was on the whole people who had voted Leave in the referendum, who were often on low to middle incomes, and people who felt that the Labour Party had left them, not that they had left the Labour Party, although, of course, most of them didn't vote for Labour at that time. So I think it was really important that we showed them that respect. And they would talk about the left of centre, and this is the same is true in the Democrats in the States too, that they somehow look down on people. And the research we've just done immediately post-election, when people talk, particularly when they talked about cultural issues, as we might call them in this country, that somehow they were bad people if they didn't express the same views as the dominant media had, that it wasn't just that someone was not able to disagree, that they somehow looked down on them and thought they were a bad person and judged them for, I think, holding views or questions that I think are more than legitimate. So what about the alternative that Michael's put forward, democratic pluralism, this community of communities? So I've got a number of questions that I would be really interested to hear more about, or a number of challenges. So I want to understand more about, is this post-liberal? Does liberalism give way to it? What does it mean? A bit more of that. My kind of second question is really about the kind of inequalities that exist in all communities and in every room. And anyone who's ever been to a trade union branch meeting, a parish council, or even in a seminar room will know that there are inequalities in every room. And Russell Dalton called this the social participation gap. So when we come together, these are not, utopian systems where, there is no inequality between us. We know that inequality plays out. So how do we address that in this pluralism? And my kind of fundamental question is, what about the agency of working class people themselves, what they actually want for themselves and their lives? And I agree, like, part of what we need to do, and why I wanted to come today, is to hear about the ideas people have got for the future, and I accept much of the critique, is I think we should enable greater place, community, workplace organisation. But people have to do it for themselves. It has to be bottom up. And I'm not convinced that there has been a new social order that's about to emerge from that. I think it's part of the answer. But I would like to hear more about how do we think that this might emerge. I think fundamentally we need to answer the question of an alternative economic settlement to address this principal cause of dissatisfaction. So what's that alternative here? And just to underline the warning in what Michael said too, that a post-liberal could mean illiberal, and of course that doesn't necessarily mean more freedom, more security, more opportunity. We just have to look around the world about what that gives way to. I think much of this stems from the failure of the social democratic model after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, and the subsequent failure to then define a compelling successor to that, and that is what we are in search of. So what might a model be that gave more agency for working class people? Well, I think this deal, a more secure deal, whatever it is, your hard work and your talent that gets you on in life, where it's your reward that's the reward that is what's rooted in your effort. So rewarding work over wealth, a state education system that really fuels and incentivizes a broad range of talent and building the next generation of thinkers and doers, and that is mirrored in a working world that values the doers and the carers as well as the thinkers. And later on I think we'll be hearing from David Goodhart, who's just written a new book, but one of his other books has absolutely made this argument about the fact that we over-recognise kind of cognitive ability and we are not recognising the broader suite of skills that people have, and that I think is absolutely core of why so many people feel disenfranchised. And I think that can be brought together into a national politics of belonging. So I think this model, where you have to give people much, much more agency, is compatible and even complementary to greater self-organising and more power locally. But I would like to hear how those things could be brought together. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. I very much welcome the conference and Michael's lecture this morning. And I think the overall argument is a very powerful one, that liberalism is under attack because it cannot deliver the self-correcting markets that offer free and fair economic competition, political renewal, cultural reconciliation. And the malign reality is somewhat different. It consolidates winners, economic monopolies, politically entrenched divides, canyons of class, geography, education, cultural echo chambers where opposition is cancelled. The remedy to dismantle such concentrations of economic, political and cultural power and challenge meritocratic arguments that bolster and help reproduce those structures. This might involve new antitrust initiatives, attacks on sites of monopoly political power, such as universities, and confront woke culture. The title Postliberalism suggests a sense of an ending. So left unchecked, what comes next? And he posits mafiocracy, unaccountable oligarchy, tyranny, universal corruption versus Brazilianization, more incompetent institutional decay and evolving oligarchy, a West that resembles Latin America, I think was the phrase. So what are the alternatives? Socialism, although that today means little more than liberal capitalism plus a welfare state, distributionism or subsidiarity, a devolved republicanism, although a small and somewhat anachronistic remedy, I think, was the conclusion, or a pluralism that harks back to guild traditions, post-war expansion of collective bargaining, institutional arrangements to bolt the working class both into the corporate state and the workings of the economy. Michael, emphasising the third option, posits class reconciliation and the brokering of interests to challenge modern oligarchy. In general, I very much support the argument. I just want to make three general points. The first regarding the term post-liberalism and the nature of that debate, and then a point each on class and religious politics that Michael emphasises in his quest for political renewal. So, on the question of post-liberalism, I get the frustrations with a liberalism conditioned by liberal economics and hyper-individualised identity politics. I get the production of economic monopolies, concentrated political constituencies and sort of cultural binaries and thought binaries. But I would ask, are there other liberal traditions beyond this modern iteration and the classical liberalism that are worth excavating in any project of political renewal? For instance, the 1870s produced this neoclassical economic revolution, contracting economics into an individualised science of society. In response, in the late 19th century, we saw a new or a social liberalism emerging with figures like T.H. Green, Hobhouse, Hobson, challenging self-interest with questions of character and positive liberty, challenging inherited laissez-faire economics and doctrines. It believed in progressive taxation, pension and social security reform, saw property rights as conditional, supported public ownership of natural monopolies, workers' rights, etc., etc. Or take another example, US New Deal liberalism, influenced Attlee's post-war attempt to regulate the market and civilise capital. The idea of a British New Deal, the welfare state, socialised medicine, consciously echoed FDR's second Bill of Rights to rebuild US citizenship through the provision of 8 fundamental economic and social entitlements. Now, obviously, that liberal tradition has eroded, not least because of the way human rights lawyers have contracted it to questions of civil and political rights rather than economic and social rights. But New Deal liberalism was a response to a domestic US fascist threat and later a global fight against tyranny and authoritarianism. So could such approaches help in any contemporary battle with process forces pushing us towards oligarchy today? Our government would run a mile from such an agenda, but maybe reframing citizenship around access to housing, medicine, work, social protections, freedom from fear could have a real political potency today. Call it a populist response to oligarchy. So does the idea of post-liberalism truncate the history of liberalism and bypass helpful traditions in any question of political renewal today? And two other points, one about class politics and then about religion. Michael's strongest argument is the idea to rebuild Labour as an economic and social force. Some think the present government is doing that with this so-called New Deal for working people, what it calls the biggest overhaul of employment rights in a generation. I fear it's a missed opportunity, actually. Today, Labour is basically re-establishing the 2010 status quo ante, removing Tory reforms and enacting new individual legal rights. Nothing regarding company law reform, redefining stakeholder or worker interest in the architecture of the farm, nothing on economic or industrial democracy, nor extended contract compliance. Outside of social care, very little in terms of extending organised terms and conditions into unorganised sectors or sectoral bargaining. There are minor changes to a union recognition procedure, but that was a failure since its inception in 1999-2000. Historically, Labour's role was to extend collective bargaining with minimal legislative interventions, but today we focus on individual rights rather than rebuilding the power of Labour. It's a sort of type of thinking that views so-called left-behind communities as passive and inert, full of individual needs for fiscal and legal remedies. An alternative is to rebuild the economic and social power of the working class. In recent years, the working class have demonstrated they are far from passive, actively reclaiming a politics that has failed them. So we require a bolder vision from the Party of Labour, not least because the costs of inaction will be dramatic. Finally, on the question of religion, today's politics is being, I would argue, reset around questions of religion and identity, and over the coming years we will witness profound community upheaval and religious strife. Figures such as Tommy Robinson are deserting his Irish Catholic heritage and consciously adopting a Christian and nationalist language and imagery to propel forward cultural dissent. So too Reform UK. However, it's not just a case of evangelical traditions of the far right. A distinct aggressive Catholicism will likely emerge here, slipstreaming behind figures like J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel, Victor Oborne and the like. Conversely, protests over Gaza spilled into the last general election and foreshadowed the possible emergence of a Muslim UK party. We can also identify a more muscular Hindu nationalist political movement with covert support from foreign governments, which is spreading throughout this country. The politics of Harrow reflect this at the last election. So too violence between Hindu and Muslim communities across Leicester, all signalling what might lay ahead in urban settings in this country. Yet recently, Britain elected consciously the most secular parliament in its history. Apart from at the margins, the Labour government is uninterested in faith and ill-equipped to build a genuine religious dialogue. In fact, fearful of populism, it will retreat into an ever more technocratic administration, preoccupied with questions of policy delivery and utility in response to the sense of populist upheaval. Precisely, I'd argue, the wrong response. Look at last week's plans for measurable milestones, I think they were called, a utilitarian politics of fiscal transfers incapable of addressing questions of spiritual national renewal. In contrast, and I'm a Labour man, in recent weeks, Kemi Badenoch has developed an evangelical hostility to the progressive left and how it's embedded in the bureaucratic state. Recently, she wrote of a fear of a new progressive ideology that is on the rise, one fueling identity politics and an assault on both democracy and the nation state, one escalating its social and economic control through the overreach of a bureaucratic regulatory state. She wrote this: culture and economics are entwined. The new progressive ideology sees the nation state and related migration controls as a purveyor of historic injustice. The moral imperative for Conservative, then, is to defeat this ideology and its carrier, which is a malign new left, themed not dissimilar to those emerging across the water in terms of the think tanks shaping the next phase of Trumpism. And I think Badenoch might be moving with the spirit of the times. She suggests conservatism must become a national force equipped with moral certainty in defence of the sacred. Now, quietly, it seems we've retreated from an era of muscular, evening the evangelical secularism, the new atheism of Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, Hitchens, which asserted a new age of reason, of disinterested scientism, actually, and the triumph of liberal rationality. And today's religious convictions appear culturally ascendant, captured in public conversions by figures such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, one of the original new atheists, the views of Jordan Peterson, plus assorted soccer players, rock stars, dodgy comedians. You know, there's a whole sort of collection of them, all confidently declaring their own belief systems. So why the renewed interest in these spiritual matters? Maybe pandemic, when we were forced to confront our own mortality. Certainly immigration, when associated cultural tensions, the decline of our ideological traditions, political alienation, institutional distrust, a sense of social anxiety, all of them we can point to, the threats to humanity through technological change, the effects of conflict and war. Cumulatively, there appears a distinct religious turn in response to a secular progressive ideology deemed responsible for a sense of national decline. 2 decades ago, the new atheism was part of a reaction to the religious fundamentalism driving 9/11. 2 decades on, in contrast, growing political movements are consciously seeking to defend a sense of the sacred. There's a real problem here for a government because they're asking the wrong questions. Their utilitarian milestones invoke the suspension of the ethical and are not the answers for those seeking a sense of spiritual renewal. It's a sort of politics of a very different order. Even if they deliver on their terms, they're playing on a very different part of the pitch because their opponents are wishing to return to moral questions. And politics of the left has deserted this territory. It helps account for the demise of social democracy. And one final point, on a more positive note, one of the few points of light, as far as I see it, one person on the left who seems to be asking the right questions is someone who I'd never heard of until a couple of weeks ago when Adrian sent me some of his work, actually. Senator Chris Murphy. I've just been talking to Michael about him. He realises politics of deliverism and utility is way too underpowered to confront a political reformation occurring all around a defence of the sacred. Politics needs a radical reimagination. Murphy calls it a spiritual renaissance, a new public philosophy, not just about maximising utility, but one of human virtue and reimagining the very idea of justice and a just society. He cites Dr. King, Chavez, Bobby Kennedy, and others, all inspired by different motivations garnered from their religious upbringing and thought, who have in their own times rethought the very purpose of politics, returning to its classic definition. One that can speak for the indignities intrinsic to modern capitalism, anchored around a discernible working class and a renewed sense of what is just. So it seems to me, Michael, that one of your fellow countrymen on my side of the political divide is actually rising to some of the questions that you've asked of us today. And thanks very much for your very thoughtful lecture. Thank you.
Michael, I also wanted to start with thanking you for your lecture and for really all the work you've done. I think the New Class War, which you published, I think in 2020, was one of those seminal texts because not only did it put class firmly at the heart of the political conversation, but it also already, I think, anticipated a lot of what we're discussing here, which is what are the constructive alternatives to all the broken and bankrupt ideologies all around us. So in that book, you already outlined that the sort of technocratic neoliberalism was only going to further fuel the flames of a demagogic populism, which of course can be of the left or of the right. And we've seen this here in this country with Corbyn, as well as with figures like Nigel Farage. And that you already then outlined the sort of democratic pluralism that you think is the way out of the mess we're in. But before going on to those, to that alternative, and also the ones that you, I think, perhaps too quickly discard, that is, elements of socialism and distributism, I want to say something about what I've learned from you about the nature of liberalism. Because I think what we can all see is that while liberalism is politically and intellectually in deep crisis, it's also not just imploding, it's not just collapsing in the way that perhaps we would like to see. You know, as you put it in your lecture, liberalism is unstable and self-liquidating, yet it also endures. The institutions, the policies, the ideas are still deeply entrenched. And so I think the question is, how do we make sense of, on the one hand, the endurance of liberalism, on the other hand, this tendency towards self-abolition? And if we are going to be drawing some parallels with Soviet communism, you know, because both liberalism and communism are materialistic and buy into a certain idea of determinism, then I think the question is, are we going to be moving towards some form of implosion, or is it perhaps more something like putrefaction? Liberalism will decay and drag everything down, and yet it will not implode like the Soviet system. And if it doesn't implode, then how do we move beyond it? You know, how do we move to that post-liberal era that you know, we're trying to understand here? And I guess the point is that liberalism, you know, and here I wonder whether there's any opportunity for renewal. You know, it really looks like a zombie thing, something that, you know, hasn't died but also cannot be brought to life. And it can't be brought back to life because all the conditions for liberalism are no longer there. So the only time when liberalism seemed to be not so destructive was when it was embedded. The sort of post-war liberalism that Sam Moyne and others have written about, where you had culture, religion, you had mass membership organizations that you, Michael, have also written about. And those conditions simply do not exist. So those conditions for a liberal renewal, I think, simply aren't with us. We are today more atomized and more authoritarian than arguably at any other point in modern history. Perhaps not totalitarian in the sense of the interwar period, but at that time, we were not nearly as atomized. And that combination of atomization and authoritarianism, I think, means that a liberal renewal seems really impossible. And liberalism itself, of course, is now on the side of atomization and authoritarianism very much, so much so that contemporary liberalism, perhaps not the new liberalism that John Cruddas was talking about, but certainly contemporary liberalism, undermines all of the principles and practices of liberality, such as freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. And it's therefore no surprise that liberals increasingly look like petty authoritarians, like secular priests, because that is very much in line with the philosophy. And here we should remember what Maurice Cowling wrote about already 30, 40 years ago, and that is that liberalism's roots, certainly English liberalism's roots, are very much in the tradition of positivism. That isn't all just, you know, going back to Hobbes, Locke, or Kant. It is also going back to Kant, and this idea that really there is nothing beyond the empirically verifiable, and that the reverse side of liberalism is also that it's very, very idealistic. So you get the worst with liberalism, the worst positivism, and the worst abstract idealism, all fused in one. And if that's the case, then I think we do need to think of alternatives that are not limited to pluralism, though I think pluralism is absolutely at the heart of it. Because I think where pluralism doesn't answer the question of the nature of human life, the nature of society, what binds us together, and what can bring about economic justice, political mixed government, and proper constitutional rule, is that question of ontology, that relationality. How are we going to answer the question of why we're political and social animals, and why at the heart of human nature is that desire to associate around shared ends? And here I think there are traditions in socialism and distributism that we should revive. Whether it is the socialism of figures like R.H. Tawney, with again deep roots in Richard Hooker, going all the way back to notions of natural law in Aquinas, or indeed in France, Solidarism with its account of relationality. These are all traditions that I think can nurture a pluralist alternative. And distributism, whilst I can see all the economic arguments that make that difficult today, nevertheless, if we think of it in terms of not just giving people meaning and income through work, and that is vitally important, as John and Claire have also said, but also giving people access to assets, distributing the national assets we need to grow, so that actually people have a stake in the country, in society, in the economy. So I can see elements of a ethical socialism and distributism really being part of that conversation. And I think they are not just compatible with pluralism, I think they're vitally important to ground and anchor pluralism in something even deeper than what you have developed. But I think the fact that you already 4 years ago talked about democratic pluralism as the way out of the liberal mess, I think has been an invaluable contribution. And I want to thank you again for that and for being here today. Thank you.
So, Michael, I see you've got about 2 pages worth of questions there to answer, so I don't want to add many more before we open it up. But I suppose I thought from all of the contributors there, one question jumped out at me was that if liberalism is a kind of self-liquidating ideology, couldn't you make the case that that is also true of the kind of pluralism that you're talking about and liquidated itself perhaps in the 1970s? I'd like to hear from you about that. And also John's point about the return of the sacred and Kemi Badenoch. I mean, it also strikes me that Kemi Badenoch describes herself as a classical liberal and talks about liberalism being hacked, and that's her phrase. And in fact, in the House of Commons, we had the question recently about a return to essentially a blasphemy law. And Keir Starmer was quite hesitant, and Kemi Badenoch yesterday has talked about having to reject that outright on essentially liberal principles. So is liberalism itself not a kind of sacred ideal in the West? And is that not essentially a good thing? So anyway, Michael, they're my thoughts. Over to you.
Is this on? Can you hear?
I can hear.
Well, I've got a loud voice, so I need this. Let me begin before going to some of the challenges and responses of Claire and John to Adrian. My conception of politics has been profoundly influenced by my friend Ernesto Cortes Jr., who's a great Mexican-American community activist, and he has a wonderful line I love to quote, which is, politics is about getting people to do the right thing for the right reasons, but also getting them to do the right thing for the wrong reasons, which are their reasons, okay? And I think in a plural society with people of different creeds and ethnic backgrounds and traditions, you want a common agenda in which the different communities within your society have their own internal communal reasons for working together, okay? So the Jewish community has a certain conception of social justice, and the Christian and the Muslim and the secular, and they can agree on this. It's kind of like a Venn diagram. There's overlapping policies. But I think it's, honestly, I think it's a dead end to say that everyone has to agree on first principles of ethics or even of metaphysics, and then we will deduce what the policies are. I just don't think this is possible. Or desirable, for that matter. And I share John's concern about, you had the new atheists on the right. You have 2 groups now, I mean on the left, but you have 2 groups now on the right. There are the people who are kind of civilizationally religious. That is, they're basically, by Christian, they mean white, or they mean Western European or something, or just kind of like orthodoxy and Putin's Russia, or maybe Hinduism in Modi's India. It's really a symbol of nationalism. It's not really religion. right? It's being manipulated, and I think that's a danger. And on the other hand, you have increasingly a secular right, which is going back to those great favorites, Nietzsche and eugenics and social Darwinism and so on, and that may be an even greater threat in the long run, because after 1945, this secular pseudoscientific eugenics right was discredited, and there are signs of it kind of percolating back up. So, and while we're on the subject of religion, I think we absolutely have to avoid anything like a Millet system of the Ottoman Empire, or even consociationalism or pillarization in the Dutch sense. That by that I mean assigning people to ethno-religious communities whose leaders, the ethnarchs, then are consulted on a variety of public policy topics. I'm against that. So what I'm talking about, like the mid-century religious pluralism in the United States, it's on narrow matters relating to parochial Catholic schools and secular religious schools of various kinds and so on. I don't want there to be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Druid representatives holding forth on taxation and the budget and all of that. I think that, as we've seen in Lebanon and other countries, would be a disaster. So very briefly, a lot of good points, but I'm going to respond to what was sort of a similar question from Claire and from John. How could a new economic tripartism or corporatism in the political science sense emerge? And John is quite right that in the 19th century, and this is true in the United States as well as in Britain and Western Europe, labor leaders like Samuel Gompers wanted the government to keep out of organization and to keep out of collective bargaining because they figured the government would be on the side of the employers. They just wanted to be able to do deals. And the government at most was kind of a broker providing good offices. But that depended on a kind of enterprise-based mass membership, bottom-up craft unionism, which I think it's relevant in some areas. So for example, if you look at warehouses now, these are kind of the factories of the 21st century, like Amazon warehouses. I think it can work there. Most workers now either work for small service companies or for they're contractors. They're defined as self-employed, even though they're really workers under labor law. Or they're kind of self-employed artisans who are quasi-employees because they have one or two major clients. So, and it's really a situation where the historical parallels are the early 19th century in Britain and other industrializing countries, where you had like the printers, and the tailors, and they had lost their guilds, but these were not factory workers, right? They could not shut down this aerospace or steel or automobile company. And so I think you have to, and the other historical parallel that comes to mind is what in Britain was called the sweated trades 100 years ago. And these were particularly female. They were largely women doing piecework for textile companies. They would sew in their homes, right, for a certain amount for really poverty wages. And the Trade Boards Act of 1909 was introduced by the young Winston Churchill, then a liberal. And he said these sweated industries are parasites on the public because the taxpayer has to keep these people from destitution. And so the UK established trade boards with representatives of business, government, and the sweated industries, who would then set minimum wages in these particular areas until, under neoliberalism, these were abolished in 1993, I believe the year was, right, by the neoliberal reformers. And so I think, on the one hand, in the highly atomized occupations, you have, in democratic states like New York and California, there's a move to revive old early 20th century trade boards, or wage boards as we call them, on the one hand. But at the other extreme, I think that there is a role for the state to do, it's not the present Republican Party, and not the present Democratic Party, maybe not the Labour Party in the UK, but to impose, not in a Mussolini fascist way, but just to automatically enroll members of a occupation by default into the kind of French-style universal coverage. So if you're a janitor, you're just automatically enrolled, right, within a collective bargaining regime. And you could have works councils within, the organizations, and then you could vote for the representatives who negotiate with the employers, and they could be nonprofits. They don't have to be, conventional trade or craft unions, or they can be political party affiliates. So I think we have to think creatively about that. But I think the state, whether in the form of wage boards or these automatic enrollment schemes, is going to have to play a greater role. And we can't wait for bottom-up, factory by factory, shop by shop organization.
I'm conscious of time, so I think we should try and get some questions, get as many as we can, and open it up to the panel. So let's take a few in one go. Okay, we've got one here, one at the back. Anybody else? And one at the back there. Do you want to go first?
Sure. I like the presentation very much. What I was wondering, though, is whether the description of liberalism was a little bit too homogeneous in a sense, because I think that there's aspects of you divided economic, political, and cultural. On the economic level, you talked about monopoly capitalism, but I think the examples you gave would really sort of a oligarchic kind of capitalism, where there would be competition reduces like to maybe 2 or 3, 4 big corporations, but I would say that that's still healthy kind of competition, because as long as you have more than one, there is going to be competition, and it's much better than the alternative, which is often has been, this is what I see as the big problem, is a kind of monopoly of the state in certain areas. I mean, if you look at health insurance, there's lots of big health insurance companies, but Medicare, Medicaid, that's the big monopoly for lots of people, and that seems to be where the big problem is. And so that I just kind of see in the economic sphere that I think we still want that kind of liberalism that would create the competition. In politics, I mean, I feel like there's I think we want to promote the liberalism, and it sounds like that's what you wanted to do as well, because we talk about freedom of speech, freedom of religion. That's what we really want. We don't want anything post-liberal in that sphere. But in the cultural sphere, I think I agree with this idea of the sacred, where we don't really want that type of liberalism so much in the cultural sphere, where in fact what the belief in the sacred is not so much a focus on individual choice, but really in individuals subordinating themselves to something greater, and that's not really very liberal, right? And in fact, but that's not something that we probably would want to support in the sense that that type of subordination of the individual, that's really what gives meaning to people's lives as well. So I feel like we want to differentiate more between the different spheres and kind of see the real positive aspects that we want to retain in some of the aspects of liberalism. So anyway, I'm just
before you come in on that, let's get 2 more. Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. So I just wondered if we could hear a little more from Michael, especially about the religious settlement in this pluralist order, particularly because it's not a delay system, it's not consociationalism. So would it involve primarily, for instance, giving religious organizations more autonomy and association freedom? And if so, how would it be different from what kind of non-woke or anti-woke liberals are saying is the true liberalism, which was meant to protect religious freedom?
And the final question at the back.
So I'm interested in how the concept of interest is emerging. What you were saying, Michael, in terms of association in a way of countering the sort of libertarian atomization. And just Michael of Edmund Burke, who said that the MP's job is to represent interest, not to do with other people, and that might
I also thought about little platoons and Burke when we were thinking about this. Should we go across the panel in this direction?
Well, briefly, yes, of course. The premise of pluralism is there is no discernible unitary will of the sovereign people. That's just rejected. And you want some kind of consensual bargaining, and that's how you get the common good. So I agree with that entirely. In terms of the religious settlement, I'm biased as an American because of all of the English-speaking countries, the U.S. is the most hostile to institutional religion, which may sound strange, but because of Catholicism. So every state constitution has what's called a Blaine Amendment, banning public funding of religious schools. And it was part of this wave of anti-Catholic hysteria associated with Irish and German immigration. To their credit, the UK and Scotland and Ireland and Australia and New Zealand have always had a system in which religious schools parents can choose. But for liberals in the United States, who are much more dogmatic, this is just theocracy. It's like Iranianism, you know, the Canadian system in which you can send your kid to a Catholic parochial school, right, or a Jewish shul instead of the public monopoly school. But I do think you need to have that kind of thing. You have to have some public funding of religious institutions. And the argument against this that I encounter is, well, but then you'll have madrasas, and then you'll have, you know, you'll be rearing jihadists and so on. Well, that was the argument for the Blaine Amendments, right? That all of these triumphalist papists will take over the government, and I think it was exaggerated then, and it's wrong now. Very briefly, about innovation, and I'm also the author of a book, co-author with Robert D. Atkinson, an economist, entitled Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business. So I am a great fan of large dynamic industrial corporations, but the conventional neoclassical academic economic account of how innovation comes about is wrong. The correct account was devised by Joseph Schumpeter, who in his term creative destruction did not mean companies coming in and out of business. He meant giant trustified firms mobilizing their vast capitalist super profits to invest in completely new technologies, right? So it's like the laptop instead of the typewriter. That's what Schumpeter meant. He didn't mean competing on price by cutting wages or by making people work longer. And Schumpeter's greatest heir in the economics profession is the late William Baumol, who described the main drive of industrial and technological innovation as oligopolistic competition. It's not free market competition. That is, you have a few big oligopolies, and you have Tesla and Google or Alphabet trying to invent the first electric car or the first flying car or something like that. That's not going to happen through lots of little tiny firms, right? It takes enormous amounts of scale, and it's fine. But I think you have to distinguish these dynamic Schumpeterian industrial corporations, which, as long as they treat their workers okay, you know, more power to them. You have to distinguish them from natural monopolies based on network effects, which really should be regulated like public utilities, in my opinion.
John?
I've got very little to add. Your point about blasphemy law, I thought was quite interesting. As alongside some of the ways that politicians were using their own religious convictions around the assisted dying debates, just seemed to me to be sort of politics taking a more religious form in Parliament in the most secularised polity in terms of those affirming in history. And that reflects something that's moving out in the country, which is where political forces are increasingly taking a religious tenor or character. And how that is reconciled to a politics is going to be very interesting. That's why I pointed to Badenoch, who is at least trying to, you know, navigate that terrain. without recourse to a sort of cold technocratic utilitarianism, which I'm afraid is the sort of default position of the government, which is very dangerous for them. And I worry for them because of that. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, she's certainly interesting on these questions, because she's almost a civilizational Christian as well, I think. And in the interview in The Spectator, she spoke more of her ethnic background as a Yoruban Nigerian. That was her most powerful influence. Anyway, I'll pass on.
Just to come back on the question about the concept of interest and the will of the people, and I think Michael's talks about the sorts of models, in a sense, for our industry, I guess, and state relations primarily, but I also think that we should consider how we can kind of supplement with models of greater participation, because actually assisted dying debate, well, debate in inverted commas, is a really good example of where we haven't had that kind of debate, and actually putting those things to the public. And as a colleague of mine was complaining about jury service, it was reminding me of what we do have some great models, actually, of the public being involved, and whether that is part of what can help connect us better and come to some better answers. So I think there's definitely merit. It doesn't always have to be the big citizens' assemblies either. It can be in much more everyday, grounded forms of democracy that could be a good supplement to what we have currently.
You know, let me just start with David's very good question. Sure, we can differentiate different strands within liberalism and attempt to sort of rescue what's perhaps less problematic, but ultimately, you know, much of liberalism has done a number of things. It sort of artificially separates the economy from politics, from society, right? And sort of says, you know, there's the market here, the state over there, civil society somewhere else, and these are all kind of separate spheres. Then it fuses them around either kind of market state in the Western sort of neoliberal sense, or a state market in the sort of more state capitalist sense of China and Russia. And it ends up always abolishing all the intermediary institutions. It always undermines them and weakens them relentlessly. It doesn't really give civic associations any sort of proper autonomy. And that is why ultimately it's then impossible to rescue any form of proper balance between rights and obligations that John talked about. You know, it's just not in liberalism's nature, to recognize that we have a form of self-rule because of that, you know, fundamental decision at the beginning, you know, with Hobbes and Locke, to sort of say there has to be, you know, a central sovereign, and only if there's a central sovereign there isn't that anarchy, and then you can have some rights given to sovereign individuals. And the nation state is just the individual writ large. It's just not going to be enough of a carapace for groups, for economic interests to be reconciled around something like the common good. So liberalism really has these fundamental flaws. And you can see this in concrete terms in the economy today, but also the issue that came up with religion. You know, what has been the great unspoken truth since, you know, for a long time now, that we saw again with the riots? We cannot name that there are deep ethno-religious tensions. Liberalism either talks about multiculturalism and says, oh, we have different races, but then multiculturalism somehow holds it all together. Or else we'll sort of say, no, it's just about right-wing thugs who cause problems, and law and order is enough of a response to that. Well, law and order may be part of the response to restore some semblance of stability. But if you're denying that there are these ethno-religious tensions in society because you're imposing some artificial multiculturalism on top, it just does not work. And that needs to be properly confronted. And absolutely, the sacred is very much part of it. It never went away, of course, as even Peter Berger himself realized when he sort of retracted the thesis of secularization. And the fact is, if we don't, you know, properly respect the self-expression of different religious traditions, while also at the same time, and this is where I agree with Michael, John and Claire very, very much, at the same time talking about concrete ways of integrating this so that religion isn't a separate thing on the side, but is a full part of the economy and society and culture, then I think we have a better chance. And liberalism always oscillates between the individual and the collective, but doesn't give expression to that relational. And just to finish on the economy, again, very much in agreement with Michael about having to confront monopoly capitalism and championing, you know, proper sort of corporations that have, you know, more of a social and an ethical purpose. And yes, some of them will be large, and that's important. You know, we aren't going to be having lots and lots of small car producers, or indeed small tech innovators. But I think the key thing that we need to have is a much greater balance. So you can have small and medium-sized firms that actually play a bigger role. For instance, if you rewrite procurement rules and say, you know, a certain share of public procurement should be going to small and medium-sized companies. You know, otherwise it's always going to end up with the same big players. So this is part of, you know, a change of mind and of legislation. And finally, public utilities, I think, are absolutely vital in this. And then on public utilities, such as tech platforms, you can have different kind of competition, including smaller competition, which is actually more innovative, while the larger ones, as we know, shut down innovation. So if we want more innovation in the West, and we want to be able to compete with the likes of China, we actually have to create that mixed economy once more. And yes, large firms are part of it, but I think we can also include small and medium firms in that because of the energy and the dynamism that they bring.
Now, Adrian, you're the organizer of this. Do we have to bring this to an end now, or can I ask for a couple more questions? It's past half past.
I think we should probably break for coffee, not least to give our audience a bit of respite.
Okay.